The moment my daughter-in-law started laughing at my house, I knew something inside our family had just broken. It wasn't a small laugh. It was the kind of laugh people make when they believe something is embarrassing. Caroline stood in the middle of my living room, slowly turning in a circle as if she were inspecting a piece of furniture in a thrift store. Her high heels clicked against the old wooden floorboards that my husband Thomas had installed with his own hands more than 30 years ago. She glanced at the ceiling, then at the curtains, then at the faded wallpaper near the hallway. Finally she looked at my son Daniel and said the words that made the room go silent. "Daniel, you actually grew up here?" Her lips curved into a smile that wasn't kind. And then she laughed again. Not politely, not nervously, but like the whole situation was some kind of joke. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. He simply stared down at the floor, rubbing the back of his neck the way he used to when he was a nervous teenager. And in that moment, something painful settled into my chest, because I realized my son wasn't embarrassed for me. He was embarrassed by me. But what Caroline didn't know that afternoon, what neither of them understood yet, was that the little house she was mocking sat in the center of the most valuable land on Maplewood Street. And legally speaking, almost the entire street still belonged to me. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 62 years old, and I've lived in the same small house in Chicago for nearly 4 decades. If you drove past it today, you probably wouldn't look twice. The porch paint is peeling in a few places. The wooden steps creak when someone walks up them. The front yard is small, with an old oak tree that leans slightly toward the street. It isn't the kind of house that appears in real estate magazines. But to me, that house holds more memories than any luxury apartment ever could. My husband Thomas and I bought it when we were young and completely broke. Back then Maplewood Street was nothing special. Just a quiet block filled with working-class families. Mechanics, teachers, nurses, construction workers. People who woke up early every morning, worked hard all day and went home tired at night. When Thomas and I first moved in, the house was almost empty. We didn't have proper furniture yet. Our living room contained nothing more than 2 folding chairs and a small wooden table someone had given us for free. But we were happy. I still remember our first night in that house. We were lying on a mattress on the floor of the bedroom, staring up at the bare ceiling. The windows didn't even have curtains yet. Streetlights from outside spilled into the room. Thomas reached over and squeezed my hand. "One day this neighborhood is going to be worth a fortune," he said. I laughed. Back then the idea sounded ridiculous. The sidewalks were cracked. Half the houses looked older than the people living inside them. And downtown Chicago felt like another world entirely. But Thomas had always been good at seeing things other people missed. Years passed. Our son Daniel was born. The house slowly filled with furniture, toys, and the kind of little messes that come with raising a child. Daniel grew up racing toy trucks down the hallway and building blanket forts in the living room. On summer evenings he would sit on the front porch with his father, asking endless questions about the world. Thomas always answered patiently. Sometimes I would watch them from the kitchen window while I cooked dinner. Those were simple years. Happy years. But about 25 years ago, Thomas came home one evening carrying a thick folder full of papers. He spread them across the kitchen table and tapped one of the pages with his finger. "The house next door is going up for sale," he said. I frowned. "We can barely afford this one." Thomas smiled in that quiet way he always did when he believed he had discovered something important. "Exactly," he said. "That's why we need to buy it now." First I thought he was joking. But he explained his reasoning carefully. Chicago was expanding. Developers were slowly buying property in nearby neighborhoods. Eventually, he believed, the value of land around Maplewood Street would rise. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not even for 10 or 20 years. But eventually. It was a long-term gamble. A risky one. Still, Thomas had always been careful with money. And after several long conversations, we did something that felt completely crazy at the time. We bought the house next door. The owner was retiring and moving to Arizona. He sold it for a price that felt almost suspiciously low. For several years we rented it out to a young couple who worked downtown. Then something interesting happened. Another neighbor moved away. Thomas bought that house too. A few years later, an empty corner lot became available. Thomas bought that as well. Little by little, quietly, without telling anyone outside the family, we began collecting pieces of Maplewood Street. Thomas used to joke that one day we might own the entire block. I always rolled my eyes when he said that, but secretly I admired his vision. Unfortunately, life has a way of changing plans. 10 years ago, Thomas died suddenly from a heart attack. One moment he was sitting in the living room reading the newspaper. The next moment he was gone. After that day, the house felt different. Quieter. Daniel had already moved out by then. The rooms that once echoed with his footsteps were silent. Still, I never considered selling the house. Not once. Because that place wasn't just wood and paint. It was my life. My memories. My history. Unfortunately, not everyone saw it that way. Under 5 years ago, Daniel met Caroline. The first time I met her, she seemed charming, beautiful, confident, perfectly dressed in a way that made me feel slightly self-conscious about my own clothes. She complimented my cooking. She smiled politely at my stories about Daniel's childhood. She even said the house had character. But sometimes people reveal their true nature in small ways. In the way their eyes linger on something they disapprove of. In the subtle pause before they speak. I noticed those things with Caroline. Still, Daniel was happy. And after losing Thomas, seeing my son happy mattered more than anything else in the world. So when Daniel proposed to her the following year, I supported him completely. Their wedding was beautiful. It was held in an elegant ballroom overlooking Lake Michigan. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above us. A string quartet played softly near the windows. Everything looked like something out of a movie. As I watched Daniel and Caroline dance together during the reception, I remember thinking that my son had built a life very different from the one he grew up in. A more glamorous life. A more expensive life. But I hoped that somewhere inside him he still remembered where he came from. Unfortunately, I was wrong. Because after the wedding, Caroline started visiting my house more often. And each time she came, her smile seemed just a little thinner. Her eyes just a little more critical. And slowly the comments began. Small ones at first. Little remarks about the furniture. About the kitchen. About the neighborhood. First I ignored them. But eventually, the comments turned into something else entirely. Something far more humiliating. And the worst part was my own son started agreeing with her. When the next morning arrived, I woke before sunrise. For the first time in weeks, the house felt strangely quiet. The argument with Daniel still echoed in my mind like a bruise that hadn't fully healed. I walked into the kitchen and made coffee, the same way I had every morning for the last 30 years. 2 spoons of grounds. Slow pour. Let it sit. But that morning I didn't drink it right away. I stared out the window at the small backyard that Daniel used to play in as a child. I could still picture him running across the grass with scraped knees and a plastic toy truck in his hand. I had raised him alone after his father died. 2 jobs. Long nights. Empty dinners. Everything I had ever done was for him. And yet somehow, somewhere along the way, he had started believing the worst version of me. The day moved slowly. I cleaned the house, folded laundry, and tried to pretend life was normal. But around noon, a black SUV stopped outside my house. 2 men stepped out. Both wore suits. One carried a leather folder. The other carried a measuring device. They walked up my driveway like they belonged there. I stepped outside. "Can I help you?" The taller man smiled politely. "Good afternoon. Are you Margaret Hale?" "Yes. My name is Victor Bennett. I represent Northbridge Development." The name meant nothing to me. He gestured toward my house. "We're conducting a property survey for the neighborhood redevelopment project." I blinked. Redevelopment? Yes. The city approved it last quarter. We've been acquiring several lots in this block. The other man began measuring the side yard. I folded my arms. "Well, nobody contacted me." Victor nodded. "That's actually why I'm here today." He opened the leather folder and pulled out a document. "Mrs. Hale, your property sits on one of the most valuable parcels in this redevelopment zone. I almost laughed. You must have the wrong house. But he didn't laugh. In fact, he continued calmly, your land connects two commercial corners. Without it, the entire development plan collapses. I stared at him. So, he slid a piece of paper toward me. It had a number printed in bold. I thought my eyes were playing tricks. I'm sorry, I said slowly. Is this correct? Victor nodded. That's our initial offer. The number had 6 zeros. My hands trembled slightly. This house isn't worth anything close to that. It is to us. The second man finished measuring and nodded toward Victor. Victor closed the folder. Of course, you're under no obligation to sell. I looked back at the paper. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar. Power. Victor placed a business card on the porch railing. If you'd like to discuss the offer, please call. Then both men walked back to their SUV and drove away. I stood there for several minutes without moving. The wind rustled through the old oak tree in my yard. The same tree Daniel used to climb when he was 8. Slowly, I picked up the paper again. The number still looked unreal. Then a thought crossed my mind. Daniel. Caroline. The way Caroline had spoken to me. The way Daniel had stayed silent. I folded the paper carefully and went inside. That evening Daniel called. His voice sounded casual. Mom, are you feeling better today? I took a breath. Yes. Listen, he said. Caroline thinks it would be nice if we had dinner again tomorrow. Just family. I almost smiled. Of course. He sounded relieved. Great. 7 o'clock. 7. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at Victor Bennett's card. Something inside me had shifted. For years I had believed that love meant sacrifice. But that afternoon, standing on my porch with that offer in my hand, I realized something else. Respect mattered too. And respect had been missing from that dinner table. The next night, I arrived at Daniel's house exactly at 7. The same house Caroline had proudly shown off before. Large windows. Stone walkway. Everything polished to perfection. Caroline opened the door. Her smile was thin. Margaret. Caroline. Daniel appeared behind her. Mom. He hugged me quickly, though it felt more like a formality than affection. We sat at the dining table again. Crystal glasses. Perfect napkins. Caroline served roasted chicken and vegetables. Dinner started with small talk. Work. Weather. Neighborhood gossip. But the tension hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Finally Caroline set down her fork. Margaret, she said sweetly, Daniel mentioned you're still thinking about selling your house. I took a sip of water. I might be. Daniel leaned forward. You should really consider it. That house is old. Caroline nodded. And honestly, the neighborhood isn't improving. I said nothing. Caroline continued. If you sold it, you could move somewhere smaller. Maybe a retirement community. Daniel added gently. It would be easier for you. I looked at them both. Then I asked a simple question. Why are you both so interested in my house? Daniel hesitated. Caroline answered quickly. We're just thinking about what's best for you. I reached into my purse and placed Victor Bennett's business card on the table. Both of them looked down at it. Daniel frowned. What's this? Northbridge Development. Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly. Who are they? A development company. Daniel leaned closer. And I met his eyes calmly. They want to buy my house. Caroline laughed lightly. I'm sure they offered something ridiculous. I slid the paper with the number across the table. Caroline picked it up. Her smile disappeared. Daniel looked over her shoulder. The room went silent. Caroline blinked twice. That can't be right. It is. Daniel looked at me slowly. They're offering you that much? Yes. Caroline's voice sharpened. You're not actually considering it, are you? I folded my hands. I might. Daniel looked stunned. Mom, that's millions. Yes. Caroline leaned back in her chair. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked nervous. Then she forced a laugh. Well, if you sold for that amount, you could buy something much nicer. I smiled softly. Perhaps. Daniel rubbed his forehead. This is insane. Caroline suddenly leaned forward. You should talk to a financial advisor. Why? Because that kind of money changes everything. I looked directly at her. Yes, I said quietly. It does. Dinner ended shortly after. As I stood to leave, Daniel walked me to the door. Mom, he said softly, if that offer is real, we should discuss it. I nodded. We will. Caroline stood behind him. In the hallway. Watching. Calculating. And for the first time since I'd met her, she wasn't looking down at me anymore. She was looking at me like I had just become very important. When I got home that night, I placed Victor Bennett's offer on the kitchen table. I stared at it for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and dialed the number on his card. Victor answered on the second ring. Mrs. Hale. Yes. I took a slow breath. I'd like to hear more about your offer. He paused briefly. Of course. Then he said something that would change everything. There's actually one detail I didn't mention yesterday. What detail? Your property alone isn't the most valuable part. I frowned. Then what is? Victor's voice lowered slightly. The land directly behind your house. I looked out the back window toward the dark yard. What about it? It's legally attached to your property title. I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't know that. Most people don't, he said calmly. But according to city records, you own nearly twice as much land as you think. I gripped the phone. How much is that worth? Victor answered quietly. If everything goes through, your property could be worth more than $8 million. The room went silent. $8 million. For the first time in my life, I realized that the little house everyone had mocked was actually the most valuable thing in the entire neighborhood. And tomorrow, my son and his wife were going to learn that too. That night, after my phone call with Victor Bennett, I didn't sleep much. $8 million. The number echoed in my mind like a sound that refused to fade. For 30 years, that little house had been nothing more than a place to survive. A roof. For walls. A reminder of the life Daniel and I built after his father passed away. But now, suddenly, that same house had become something else entirely. Opportunity. And perhaps something even more important. A mirror. A way to see people exactly as they were. The next morning Victor called again. Mrs. Hale, I've arranged for our legal team to send over the official valuation documents. I thanked him and hung up. Less than an hour later my doorbell rang. A courier handed me a thick envelope. Inside were several pages of documents, city records, and development plans. I sat at the kitchen table and carefully read every page. Victor hadn't exaggerated. The redevelopment plan showed a large commercial plaza that would connect two major streets. And right in the middle of that layout was my property. Without it, their entire design collapsed. But what truly shocked me was the land behind my backyard. According to the survey map, the narrow wooded strip behind my fence wasn't city property like I had always assumed. It belonged to my lot. Apparently, when the original neighborhood was divided decades ago, the boundary line had been drawn incorrectly in most people's minds, but not on paper. Legally, that land was mine, and developers needed every inch of it. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. Travel. A quiet home by the lake. No more worrying about bills or repairs. But before I could finish that thought, my phone buzzed. It was Caroline. Her name flashed across the screen. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. Hello. Her voice was unusually cheerful. Margaret. I hope I'm not disturbing you. No. I was just thinking about our dinner last night, she continued sweetly. I'm sure you were. She laughed lightly. Well, Daniel and I were discussing that offer you mentioned. Yes. And we think you should definitely explore it. I raised an eyebrow. That's quite a change of opinion. Oh, not really, she said quickly. We just want what's best for you. I didn't respond. After a brief pause, she added, Daniel was wondering if you'd like to come over tonight again. Tonight? Yes. We thought we could celebrate a little. Just the 3 of us. Celebrate. Yesterday she had treated me like a burden. Today she wanted to celebrate. I smiled slightly. That sounds nice. Wonderful, she said. 7 again? 7. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment. Then I folded the documents and placed them neatly back into the envelope. That evening, I arrived at Daniel's house once more. But something was different the moment Caroline opened the door. Her smile was wider, warmer. "Margaret, come in." She even stepped aside politely. The dining table looked more elaborate than before. Candles, wine. Caroline herself wore a dress that looked far more expensive than anything she'd worn earlier that week. Daniel greeted me with an enthusiastic hug. "Mom, good to see you." We sat down. Caroline poured wine into my glass. "I thought we'd celebrate your good fortune," she said. "Fortune? Well, that offer you mentioned is incredible." Daniel nodded eagerly. "You deserve it, Mom." The shift in tone was so dramatic it was almost amusing. Caroline leaned forward. "So, have you spoken with the developers again?" "Yes. And they confirmed the offer." Daniel whistled softly. "That's unbelievable." Caroline clasped her hands together. "You must be thrilled." I took a sip of wine. "It's certainly surprising." She tilted her head slightly. "So, have you decided whether to sell?" "Not yet." Daniel looked puzzled. "Why not?" Caroline jumped in smoothly. "It's a big decision, Daniel." Then she turned back to me. "But if you did sell, that would change your life completely." "Yes," I said quietly. "It would." Caroline glanced briefly at Daniel before continuing. "You know, Margaret, Daniel and I have been talking about expanding the house." "Oh, yes," she said. "Maybe adding a second wing. Or even buying a larger property." Daniel nodded along. "We've been thinking about the future." Caroline smiled sweetly. "And if you suddenly had that kind of money, we could help you manage it." I nearly laughed. "Manage it?" "Well, financial planning can be complicated." Daniel added quickly. "Caroline's father works in finance. He could advise you." I set my wine glass down slowly. "That's very generous." Caroline continued smoothly. "Families should support each other, after all." I looked at her for a moment. Yesterday she had told me I didn't belong at their table. Today she was talking about family unity. I decided to ask something simple. "Caroline, do you remember what you said to me 2 nights ago?" Her smile faltered slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean." "You told me my house embarrassed you." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Caroline forced a small laugh. "Oh, Margaret, that was just a misunderstanding, was it?" "Of course," she said quickly. "We were all tired that evening." Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, Caroline didn't mean anything by it." I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the boy who used to defend me against schoolyard bullies. But now he looked at me like someone caught between two worlds. Caroline reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "Margaret, we truly want the best. For you." Her voice was soft, carefully practiced. "Your family." I slowly pulled my hand back. "Yes," I said. "Family." Dinner continued, though the conversation grew more strategic. Caroline asked questions about the developers. Daniel asked how quickly the sale could happen. At one point Caroline even suggested I move closer to them after selling. "It would be wonderful to have you nearby," she said warmly. But behind her smile I could see calculation. Every word was measured, every expression carefully controlled. When dinner ended, Daniel walked me to the door again. "Mom," he said quietly, "this could be life-changing." "It might. If you sell, you won't have to worry about anything ever again." "That's true." He hesitated before asking the real question. "Have you thought about what you do with the money?" I looked at him carefully. "I have." "Good," he said. "Because big financial decisions should stay in the family." I didn't answer. As I stepped outside, Caroline called from the hallway. "Margaret." I turned. Her smile returned. "We should celebrate properly once everything is finalized. Perhaps. Maybe a big dinner party." "That sounds lovely." But as I walked down the driveway I realized something. They had already started planning my money, and the sale hadn't even happened yet. When I got home that night I made tea and sat at the kitchen table again. The same table Daniel had done his homework at. The same table where we once counted coins to pay bills. I opened the envelope again. $8 million. I thought about Caroline's sudden kindness, Daniel's sudden concern. Then I thought about something Victor Bennett had said earlier that day. Mrs. Hale, if you do decide to sell, we're prepared to move quickly. I picked up my phone and dialed his number again. He answered immediately. Yes, Mrs. Hale? I have a question. Of course. If I sell, how soon could the deal close? Within 2 weeks. I nodded slowly. And if I choose not to sell? He paused. Then we'll have to redesign the entire project. I see. There was a brief silence before he added something unexpected. Between us, you have more leverage than you realize. I looked around my small kitchen. Leverage. Power. For 30 years I had lived quietly. Working. Saving. Raising my son. Never imagining that one day the same people who looked down on me would suddenly need my approval. I ended the call and turned off the kitchen light. But before going upstairs, I looked out the back window once more. The dark strip of land behind my fence stretched into the shadows. Land I didn't even know I owned. Land that was now worth millions. And tomorrow, I was going to make a decision that would reveal exactly who my family really was. The real test hadn't even begun yet. The following week changed everything. Word travels faster than people expect, especially in neighborhoods where curiosity grows like weeds between sidewalks. I hadn't told anyone about the developer's offer except Daniel and Caroline. But somehow by Monday afternoon 3 different neighbors had already knocked on my door asking if I was really selling the place. By Tuesday morning, even the cashier at the small grocery store down the street said, "Heard you might be moving somewhere fancy." I simply smiled. People love stories about sudden money. But what fascinated me more wasn't the gossip. It was the change in Daniel and Caroline. 3 days after that dinner, Caroline called again. This time her voice sounded almost energetic. "Margaret, I hope you're free tonight." "For what?" "We'd love for you to come by again." I paused. That would be the 3rd dinner this week. She laughed softly. "Well, family should spend time together." Family. The word sounded almost foreign coming from her. What time? 7, of course. When I arrived that evening, the house looked different. Caroline had gone further than usual. Fresh flowers covered the dining table. Soft music played in the background. Daniel greeted me at the door with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "Mom, come in." Caroline appeared moments later holding a tray with wine glasses. "Margaret, you look wonderful tonight." I blinked. In the 5 years she had known me, she had never once complimented my appearance. But now suddenly I looked wonderful. We sat down. Dinner that evening was far more elaborate than anything before. Steak. Roasted potatoes. A bottle of wine that Daniel proudly announced cost over $200. Caroline raised her glass. "To new opportunities." Daniel clinked his glass against mine. "To Mom." I took a small sip. Caroline leaned forward. "So, have you made a decision about the house?" "Not yet." Her smile tightened slightly. "Well, you must be close." "Perhaps." Daniel rested, his elbows on the table. "Mom, we were actually thinking about something." "Oh." Caroline spoke next. "If you do sell, you'll suddenly have a lot of money to manage." "Yes. And sometimes large sums can be overwhelming." I nodded slowly. "That's true." Daniel continued. "We just don't want anyone taking advantage of you." Caroline immediately added, "Exactly. There are so many financial scams these days." I almost laughed. Just days ago, she had been the one insulting me. Now she was worried someone might exploit me. "How thoughtful of you." Caroline smiled again. "We've actually been talking about a possible solution." "What solution?" Daniel looked at Caroline, then back at me. "Well, we were thinking maybe you could let us help handle the money." I raised an eyebrow. "Handle it how?" Caroline explained smoothly. "We could create a joint investment structure." "A what?" "Basically, the money would go into a shared account where Daniel and I could help manage the investments." The room grew very quiet. I folded my hands together on the table. "And why would I do that?" Daniel spoke quickly. "Because we're family." Caroline added softly. "And we want to protect your future." Protect. It was interesting how that word appeared only after the number 8 million entered the conversation. I looked at my son carefully. "Daniel, how long have you been thinking about this?" He hesitated. Just a few days. Caroline jumped in again. We just don't want you making decisions alone. I nodded slowly. Of course. Then I asked something simple. If I didn't sell the house, would you still be this concerned about my future? Daniel shifted in his chair. Caroline answered first. Well, that's different. How? She forced another laugh. Because without the sale, there wouldn't be anything to manage. Exactly. The truth slipped out before she could stop it. Daniel quickly tried to recover. Mom, we're only trying to help. I'm sure you are. Dinner continued, but the mood had changed. Caroline became quieter. Daniel seemed slightly nervous. When the plates were cleared, Caroline brought out dessert. Chocolate cake. She placed a slice in front of me with a bright smile. You deserve something sweet tonight. I took a bite. Tasted good. But the moment was too calculated. Caroline watched me carefully. Then she asked the question she had clearly been waiting to ask all evening. Margaret, have the developers increased their offer yet? No, but they might. Perhaps. Daniel leaned forward again. If the land behind your house is really included, that must raise the value. I looked at him. Who told you about the land? His expression froze for half a second. Then he glanced at Caroline. She smiled awkwardly. Well, we may have looked into the property records. You looked into them? Just to understand the situation better. I set my fork down. That was fast. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, it's public information. Caroline leaned in slightly. That extra land is incredibly valuable. So I've heard. For a moment no one spoke. Then Caroline said something that revealed everything. You know, with that kind of money, we could finally buy the lake house we've always wanted. Daniel blinked. Caroline, but she continued. And Daniel has always dreamed of starting his own business. The room fell silent again. She had said we. Not you. Not your future. We. As if the money already belonged to them. Daniel finally cleared his throat. Mom, what Caroline means is, I understand perfectly, I interrupted gently. Caroline smiled nervously. Well, families share success. I nodded. Yes, they do. When dinner ended that night, Daniel walked me outside again. The air was cool. Streetlights flickered along the sidewalk. Mom, he said quietly, please don't misunderstand Caroline. I'm not. She just gets excited about possibilities. Of course. He hesitated. You know we love you, right? I looked at him for a long moment. The same boy I once held in my arms. The same boy who once promised he would always take care of me. I hope so, I said softly. Then I got into my car and drove home. That night I didn't turn on the lights right away. I sat in the darkness of my living room and listened to the quiet house around me. 30 years of memories lived inside those walls. Birthday cakes. Late-night conversations. Homework at the kitchen table. Everything Daniel had become began here. And yet somehow, he had forgotten that. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. Then I looked at the envelope from Northbridge Development once more. $8 million. Enough to change anyone. Enough to reveal people's true nature. But there was something Daniel and Caroline didn't know yet. Something I hadn't told them. Earlier that afternoon, Victor Bennett had called again. Mrs. Hale, our investors are becoming impatient. I understand. If you're willing to sign within the week, we're prepared to raise the offer. Raise it? Yes. How much? There had been a brief pause before he answered. $9 million. I had thanked him and ended the call. But I hadn't told Daniel. Or Caroline. Because sometimes, the best way to understand people is to let them show you exactly who they are when they believe the prize is already within reach. And judging by tonight's dinner, they were just getting started. The next few days were strangely quiet. Daniel didn't call. Caroline didn't call either. At first, I thought perhaps they had finally realized how uncomfortable their behavior had become. But by Thursday afternoon, I understood the truth. They were planning something. That evening, Daniel called. His voice sounded unusually careful. Mom, are you busy tomorrow night? No. Caroline and I are hosting a small dinner. For who? Just a few friends. Nothing big. I waited. And, well, we thought it would mean a lot if you came. I almost smiled. 3 weeks ago, Caroline had told me my presence embarrassed her. Now suddenly my presence mattered. What time? 7. When I arrived the following evening, the driveway was already full of cars. Luxury cars. A silver Mercedes. A black Range Rover. Even a sleek white Tesla. The house lights glowed warmly through the large windows. Inside, voices and laughter floated through the hallway. Caroline opened the door. And for a moment I barely recognized her. She wore an elegant black dress and sparkling jewelry. Her makeup was perfect. Her smile wider than I had ever seen. "Margaret!" she exclaimed loudly. Several guests turned toward the door. "Everyone," Caroline said brightly. "This is Daniel's mother." Polite smiles followed. I stepped inside. The house looked like it had been transformed into a small cocktail party. Music played softly. Champagne glasses clinked. A long table displayed expensive appetizers. Caroline guided me into the living room like a host presenting an honored guest. "This is Margaret," she repeated proudly. Daniel approached quickly. "Mom, I'm glad you made it." Something about his tone felt slightly nervous. Then Caroline clapped her hands lightly. "Everyone, gather for a moment." The room quieted. Guests turned their attention toward her. She took Daniel's arm and smiled dramatically. "We wanted to celebrate something very exciting tonight." I felt a strange tension in my chest. Caroline continued. "Daniel's mother has recently received an incredible offer for her property." A murmur rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "Really?" Caroline nodded proudly. "Yes. A development company is offering millions." My stomach tightened. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but he didn't stop her. Caroline raised her glass. "And since we're family, this wonderful opportunity means exciting things for all of us." Several guests congratulated Daniel. One man laughed. "Well, Daniel, looks like you hit the jackpot." Daniel forced a smile. I stood quietly near the doorway. Caroline turned to me. "Margaret, why don't you tell everyone about it?" All eyes moved toward me. For a moment the room waited. I could feel their curiosity, their assumptions, their expectation that I would confirm everything Caroline had just suggested. So I smiled politely. "Yes," I said calmly. "A developer did make an offer." "How much?" someone asked. Caroline quickly answered for me. "Several million." More murmurs spread through the room. Someone whistled softly. Caroline looked almost triumphant. She slipped her arm around Daniel and spoke again. "Daniel has always taken such good care of his mother." I noticed Daniel's expression tighten. "And of course," she continued sweetly, "family always shares in each other's blessings." The words hung in the air. Guests nodded approvingly. Some even smiled at Daniel like he had suddenly become a very fortunate man. And that's when I realized something. This dinner wasn't just a celebration. It was an announcement. Caroline had already told their friends about money that didn't belong to them. She had already begun building a future with it. Without ever asking me. Without ever knowing the truth. I walked slowly toward the center of the room. Caroline's smile brightened. "Margaret, would you like some champagne?" "No, thank you." I looked around at the guests. Then at Daniel. Then finally at Caroline. "You seem very excited about my house." Caroline laughed. "Well, of course. It's wonderful news." "Yes," I said softly. "It is." A brief silence passed. Then I added something that made the room suddenly very still. "But there's something I should clarify." Caroline blinked. "What do you mean?" "The offer hasn't been accepted." Her smile wavered slightly. "Well, not yet. And there's another detail." Daniel frowned. "What detail?" I folded my hands calmly. "The developers increased the offer." Gasps echoed quietly. Caroline's eyes widened. "Increased it?" "Yes." "How much?" I looked directly at her. $9 million. The room exploded with whispers. Someone muttered, "9 million." Daniel stared at me in shock. Caroline's face flushed red with excitement. "That's incredible." She turned toward the guests triumphantly. "You see? I told you this was huge. But I wasn't finished." "And," I continued calmly, "there's something else." The room quieted again. Caroline leaned forward eagerly. Yes. I haven't decided to sell. The silence that followed was immediate. Daniel blinked. What? Caroline laughed nervously. Oh, Margaret, of course you will. Why? She looked confused. Because that's life-changing money. For whom? Her smile disappeared completely. Daniel spoke carefully. Mom, turning down $9 million would be insane. Would it? Caroline stepped closer. You can't be serious. I am. Her voice rose slightly. Why would you keep that old house when you could have everything? I looked around the elegant room, the expensive furniture, the guests who were suddenly listening very closely. Then I looked back at her. Because it's my house. The words landed heavily. Caroline's face hardened. But think about the future. My future. Our future. There it was again. Our. As if the decision had never truly belonged to me. Daniel stepped forward. Mom, please don't make a mistake like this. I studied his face. Do you remember when you were 10 years old? He looked confused. What? You fell out of the oak tree behind my house. His eyebrows tightened. You broke your arm. Guests exchanged puzzled glances. I stayed up all night beside your hospital bed. I continued quietly. I remember. You promised me something that night. Daniel said nothing. You promised that when you grew up, you would always protect me. Caroline crossed her arms impatiently. What does this have to do with anything? I turned to her. Everything. The room was completely silent now. I looked back at Daniel. But somewhere along the way, Daniel, you forgot. His face paled. Mom, I didn't raise you so that one day you could measure my worth in millions. Caroline suddenly scoffed. Oh, please. Don't make this dramatic. I looked at her calmly. You told me my house embarrassed you. She rolled her eyes. That was before we knew what it was worth. Exactly. She had finally said it out loud. The room shifted awkwardly. Several guests looked down at their glasses. I took a slow breath. Caroline, that house raised my son. It's still a dump. Daniel whispered sharply, Caroline. But she continued. You could live somewhere beautiful instead. I already do. Her laugh was cold. That broken little place? Yes. Silence returned. Then I reached into my purse and removed the developer's offer. I placed it on the table. $9 million. Guests stared. Daniel looked overwhelmed. Caroline looked almost desperate. You have to accept it. Why? Because you'd be crazy not to. I smiled gently. That's what everyone says. Then I folded the paper again and slipped it back into my purse. But here's the truth. Caroline leaned forward anxiously. What truth? I already made my decision. Daniel's voice trembled. And? I looked at him quietly. I'm not selling. The room froze. Caroline's mouth fell open. You're joking. I'm not. Daniel shook his head slowly. Mom, that's $9 million. Yes. And you're walking away from it? Yes. Caroline exploded. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Gasps rippled through the guests. Daniel looked horrified. Caroline. But she didn't stop. You're throwing away a fortune because of a stupid emotional attachment to a rundown house. I picked up my coat. Perhaps. Then I looked at Daniel one last time. But sometimes the most valuable thing in life isn't money. His eyes were wide. What is it? Knowing who truly values you. The room was silent as I walked toward the door. Behind me, Caroline shouted one final sentence. You'll regret this. I paused at the doorway. Without turning around, I answered calmly. No. Then I stepped outside. The cool night air felt peaceful. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt clear. Inside that house, Caroline and Daniel were probably arguing already, because the future they had imagined had just disappeared. But what they didn't know yet was that the story wasn't finished. Not even close. Because the very next morning, Victor Bennett was going to call me again. And what he was about to say would change everything one final time. The morning after Caroline's dinner party, the house felt quieter than it had in years. Sunlight crept through the kitchen window and spread slowly across the old wooden table where Daniel used to sit and eat cereal before school. For a long time I simply stood there with my coffee, listening to the silence. No phone calls. No messages. No apologies. I wasn't surprised. When people reveal who they truly are, they rarely rush to admit it afterward. I had just finished washing the dishes when the phone rang. Victor Bennett. I answered calmly. Good morning, Mrs. Hale. Good morning. I hope I'm not calling too early. No, there was a brief pause before he spoke again. Our investors held a meeting last night. And they've decided they're willing to raise the offer again. I leaned against the counter. How much? $10 million. The number hung in the air. $10 million. For a house most people in the neighborhood considered outdated. For a property Caroline had once called embarrassing. Victor continued. We understand you're still hesitant. But this is likely the highest offer the company will approve. I walked slowly toward the back window and looked out at the yard. The oak tree still stood tall in the morning light. The fence looked worn. The grass uneven. But every memory of Daniel's childhood lived there. I appreciate the offer, I said finally. And I still need time. Victor sighed softly. Of course. Thank you. We ended the call. For a moment, I stood quietly staring out at the backyard. $10 million. Most people would have said yes without hesitation. Most people would have already packed their bags. But money wasn't the thing that had kept me awake at night. The truth was simpler. I wasn't deciding about the house. I was deciding about my life. Later that afternoon, the phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. His voice sounded tense. Mom, we need to talk. We always do. Can I come by? Of course. He arrived 30 minutes later. Alone. When I opened the door, he looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes. Wrinkles of stress across his forehead. Come in. He stepped inside slowly and looked around the house. For a moment he seemed younger again. Like the boy who once lived here. Caroline didn't come? I asked. He shook his head. We had an argument. I'm not surprised. Daniel sat at the kitchen table. The same chair he had used his entire childhood. For a long time he said nothing. Then finally he spoke. She's angry. About the house? About everything. I poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of him. Tell me. He rubbed his face tiredly. She thought. The sale was certain. She seemed very confident. Daniel sighed. She already told her parents we'd be able to invest in a new property. I almost smiled. Already. She even spoke to a realtor about lake houses. And the money hadn't even arrived yet. He looked ashamed. I know. The room fell quiet. Finally Daniel looked up at me. Mom, why won't you sell? I met his eyes. Why do you want me to? Because it would make your life easier. And yours. He hesitated. That too. At least he was honest. Victor called again this morning, I said. Daniel leaned forward. What did he say? They raised the offer. His eyes widened. How much? $10 million. Daniel stared at me in disbelief. $10 million. Yes. Mom, that's unbelievable. I know. He leaned back slowly. You have to accept it. I smiled faintly. That's exactly what Caroline said. Because she's right. I studied him carefully. Do you remember the first bike I bought you? He blinked. What? You were 6. Yes. You rode it down this very street. A small smile appeared on his face despite himself. You ran beside me the whole time. Because you were afraid to fall. I was. And when you did fall, you got up again. He nodded slowly. Mom. What does that have to do with the house? Everything. I sat down across from him. Daniel, I spent 30 years building a life here. I know. And somewhere along the way you stopped seeing it. His voice softened. I never meant to hurt you. But you did. He looked down at his coffee. I'm sorry. For a moment the silence between us felt heavy. Then he asked quietly, what are you going to do? I leaned back in my chair. I'm going to keep the house. Daniel looked stunned. Even for $10 million? Yes. Why? I stood and walked to the window again. Because if I sell it now, I'll always wonder whether the people around me loved me, or the money. Daniel said nothing. And I already know the answer to that question. He looked ashamed. Caroline didn't mean. Daniel. He stopped. You're a grown man. Yes. And you chose who to marry. He nodded slowly. But I won't spend the rest of my life being treated like an inconvenience. The words hung in the room. Finally Daniel stood up. I understand. Do you? I think so. He walked slowly toward the door. But before leaving he turned back. Mom. Yes. I really am sorry. I believed him. But some apologies arrived too late to undo what has already been revealed. After he left, the house grew quiet again. 2 days passed. Then 3. Daniel didn't call again. Caroline certainly didn't. By the end of the week, the neighborhood gossip had already changed. Some people said I was foolish. Others said I must be stubborn. But I didn't mind. For the first time in years my life felt peaceful. The following Monday Victor Bennett called one last time. Mrs. Hale. Yes. Our investors need a final answer. I took a slow breath. I appreciate your patience. And your decision? I'm not selling. There was a long pause. I understand, he said finally. Thank you for the opportunity. We ended the call. $10 million. Gone with a single sentence. But strangely I didn't feel regret. Instead, I felt something far more valuable. Freedom. Because the moment money left the equation, the truth about my family became perfectly clear. 2 months later I saw Daniel again. He stopped by unexpectedly one afternoon. He looked older. Quieter. Caroline moved out, he said. I wasn't surprised. She blamed me for losing the opportunity, he added. I nodded. And how do you feel about it? He looked around the house slowly. At the kitchen. The living room. The hallway filled with childhood photos. Like I forgot what mattered. I didn't answer. Some lessons must be learned without comfort. He stood there for a moment longer before quietly saying, I hope someday you forgive me. Then he left. And just like that, the house returned to silence again. The same silence that had always lived here. But now it felt different. Stronger. Because the little house everyone once mocked had done something extraordinary. It had revealed the truth. Not about money. Not about land. But about people. And sometimes, that is worth far more than $10 million.